But meet Miss Jane Marple, a quiet old lady in the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where a charming stranger, Victor Langley, dazzles everyone with promises of gold and riches. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes see through his lies. He's a conman, stealing savings and breaking hearts like poor Mrs. Price, who loses everything. With time running out, Miss Marple sets a clever trap, using her wit to unravel Victor's secrets. Fake papers, a hidden partner, and a plan to flee. Will she outsmart this deadly swindler before he ruins her village? Watch as one woman's courage saves St. Mary Mead. Chapter 1. The Charming Stranger. In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where roses climbed old stone walls and gossip buzzed like bees, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window. Her small cottage, neat as a pin, smelled of lavender and fresh scones. At 72, with snow-white hair tucked under a lace cap, she looked like any old lady knitting her days away. But her blue eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing. She sipped tea, watching the world unfold like a storybook. The village was quiet as always. Children played by the duck pond, their laughter bouncing across the green. Mrs. Baker, the postmistress, swept her stoop, waving to old Mr. Harrow, who shuffled to his grocer's shop. St. Mary Mead was a place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets didn't stay secret long. But today, something new stirred the air. A stranger had come to town. Victor Langley, he called himself, a tall man with slick black hair and a smile that sparkled like polished silver. He'd rented Rose Cottage, a pretty place with ivy-covered walls, just down the lane from Miss Marple's home. The village buzzed with talk of him. He was charming, they said, with a voice smooth as honey and stories of far-off places, India, Brazil, even the wilds of Africa. He wore fine suits, tipped his hat to ladies, and paid for rounds at the Blue Boar pub. To the villagers, he was a breath of fresh air, a worldly man in their quiet corner of England. Miss Marple, though, wasn't so sure. She'd seen men like Victor before, in her long years of watching people. Men with smiles too wide, words too sweet, eyes that darted when you asked the wrong question. As she knitted a pale pink scarf, her needles clicking softly, she thought about Victor's arrival. He'd come 3 days ago, driving a shiny car that looked too expensive for a man who claimed to be between ventures. He'd introduced himself at the vicarage, charming the vicar's wife with tales of a charity he'd supposedly funded in London. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had gushed about him to Miss Marple over tea. "He's such a gentleman," Mrs. Clement had said, her cheeks pink. "He's promised to speak at the church fete. Imagine, Jane, a man like that in St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple had smiled politely, stirring her tea. "He sounds delightful," she'd said, but her mind was already turning. A gentleman, perhaps, but gentlemen didn't always have pure hearts. She'd noticed Victor's hands, soft, with no calluses, not the hands of a man who'd worked hard. And his stories, so grand and detailed, felt rehearsed, like lines from a play. She kept her thoughts to herself, as she always did, letting the village chatter while she watched and waited. That morning, as she sat by her window, Victor Langley strolled down the lane. He wore a grey suit, a red flower in his buttonhole, and carried a polished cane that tapped the cobblestones. he stopped to chat with Mrs. Price, a widow who lived alone in a tidy cottage. Mrs. Price, plump and kind, was an easy mark for flattery. She laughed at something Victor said, her hand fluttering to her chest. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Price had a small fortune, saved from her late husband's butcher shop. Not a king's ransom, but enough to tempt a man with greedy fingers. Victor tipped his hat and moved on, pausing to charm Miss Lucy, the schoolteacher, who blushed as he complimented her hat. By the time he reached the village square, a small crowd had gathered, mostly women, but a few men too, like Mr. Tompkins, the retired banker who fancied himself clever with money. Victor stood by the war memorial, spinning a tale about a gold mine in South America. His voice carried rich and warm, promising wealth to anyone who'd listen. "It's a sure thing," he said, his smile dazzling. "A small investment now, and you'll live like lords in a year. I've seen the mine myself, glittering with promise. I'm only offering this chance to a select few." The crowd murmured, excited. Mrs. Price clutched her purse, her eyes wide. Mr. Tompkins stroked his chin, nodding. Even young Tommy, the baker's boy, stopped sweeping to listen, his broom forgotten. Victor handed out glossy pamphlets, each one printed with pictures of mountains and piles of gold. The villagers snatched them up, whispering about fortunes to be made. Miss Marple set her knitting down. She adjusted her glasses and leaned closer to the window, her lips pursed. Victor's pamphlets looked expensive, too fancy for a man just passing through, and his promises, oh, they were bold, but promises were cheap. She'd heard talk like this before, years ago, when a slick salesman had swindled her cousin's friend in Devon. That man had vanished with half the town's savings, leaving broken dreams behind. Victor Langley, she thought, was cut from the same cloth. She stood smoothing her skirt and decided to take a walk. The spring air was crisp, scented with lilacs, and the village green sparkled under the sun. She nodded to Mrs. Baker, who was sorting mail, and paused by the duck pond, where children tossed crumbs to quacking ducks. Her stroll took her past Rose Cottage, where Victor's car sat in the drive, its chrome gleaming. The curtains were drawn, but a faint light glowed inside. Miss Marple lingered, pretending to admire the roses, but her ears caught a snippet of Victor's voice through an open window. "Just a few more, and we'll be set," he said, his tone low, almost sly. "They're eating it up." A second voice, gruffer, mumbled something she couldn't catch. Miss Marple's heart quickened. So Victor wasn't alone. A partner, perhaps? She filed the thought away, her face serene as she continued her walk. By the time she reached the village hall, the crowd around Victor had grown. He was announcing a tea party at Rose Cottage, a special event for those interested in his investment. The villagers clapped, delighted. Mrs. Price spotted Miss Marple and hurried over, her face glowing. "Oh, Miss Marple, isn't it exciting? Mr. Langley says I could double my money. I'm thinking of investing, maybe £5,000. It's what George left me, you know." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind raced. £5,000 was everything Mrs. Price had. "It sounds tempting," she said carefully, "but one must be cautious with such things. Have you read the contract?" Mrs. Price blinked, flustered. "Well, no, but Mr. Langley explained it. He's so kind, Jane. He gave me a scarf, pure silk, said it was from Paris. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but sharp. A silk scarf was a small price to pay for a widow's trust. "I'm sure he's charming," she said, "but charm can hide many things. Perhaps you could show me the papers, just to be safe." Mrs. Price promised to bring them later, though her tone was hesitant. Miss Marple didn't press. She knew people clung to dreams, especially when a man like Victor dangled them so cleverly. As the crowd dispersed, Victor caught her eye. He strode over, his smile wide but his gaze cool, like a cat sizing up a mouse. "Miss Marple, I presume," he said, bowing slightly. "I've heard you're the heart of St. Mary Mead. Will you join us at my tea party? I'd love to share my venture with you." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the faintest edge. A challenge, perhaps. She smiled, her face a mask of innocence. "How kind," she said. "I may attend, though my purse is rather light. These days, I'm just a simple spinster, you know." Victor's smile didn't waver, but his eyes flickered, as if weighing her words. "Nonsense," he said. "A lady like you deserves a chance at prosperity. I'll save you a seat," tipped his hat and walked away, his cane tapping a jaunty rhythm. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind buzzing. Victor Langley was no ordinary swindler. He was clever, bold, and dangerous. She'd seen his kind before, men who preyed on trust, leaving ruin in their wake. But St. Mary Mead was her village, and she'd be darned if she let him harm it. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple brewed a fresh pot of tea and settled into her armchair. Her knitting lay forgotten as she thought about Victor. His stories were too perfect, his manners too polished. She recalled a case in London years ago, when a con man had fooled a whole neighbourhood with promises of a fake railway. That man had been caught because he'd slipped up, just once, but enough for a sharp-eyed detective to notice. Victor, she sensed, would slip up too. All she needed was time and a plan. She opened her notebook, a small leather-bound thing she kept for village matters. In it, she jotted down what she knew. Victor's arrival, his gold mine scheme, the pamphlets, the tea party, the voice in the cottage. She added a question. Who is his partner? Then, with a sip of tea, she wrote a letter to her nephew, Raymond West, a writer in London with friends in high places. Raymond was young and sometimes scoffed at her old-fashioned ways, but he trusted her instincts. She asked him to check on Victor Langley. Any records, rumours, or whispers about a man matching his description. Sealing the letter, Miss Marple felt a spark of determination. Victor thought he could outsmart a village of simple folk, but he didn't know St. Mary Mead. And he certainly didn't know Jane Marple. She glanced out her window, where the sun dipped low, painting the village gold. Somewhere out there, Victor was spinning his web, but she'd be ready to snip its threads. The tea party was tomorrow. She'd go, not as an investor, but as a watcher. Victor Langley might fool the others, but he wouldn't fool her. As she picked up her knitting, her needles clicked like a ticking clock. The game, she thought, had begun. Chapter 2. Whispers of Doubt. The morning sun spilled over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in soft gold. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming beside her. Her cottage was cosy, with lace curtains and a ticking clock, but her mind was far from peaceful. Victor Langley, The smooth-talking stranger was weaving his spell over the village, and she felt trouble brewing like a storm on the horizon. Her knitting lay untouched, a pale pink scarf half finished, as she turned over yesterday's events in her sharp mind. Victor's tea party at Rose Cottage had been the talk of the village. He'd served dainty sandwiches, poured tea from a silver pot, and charmed everyone with his grand tales of a South American gold mine. Widows like Mrs. Price and retirees like Mr. Tompkins had hung on his every word, their eyes bright with dreams of wealth. Miss Marple had gone, sitting quietly in a corner, her blue eyes watching Victor like a cat at a mouse-hole. His smile was perfect, his manners flawless, but she'd caught the way his fingers twitched when Mrs. Price asked about the mine's exact location. "Somewhere in the Andes," he'd said vaguely, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Miss Marple had sipped her tea and said nothing, but her suspicions grew roots. Now, as she buttered a slice of toast, she thought about Mrs. Price. The widow had been giddy at the tea party, clutching a glossy pamphlet Victor had given her. She'd shown it to Miss Marple, pointing to pictures of glittering gold and smiling miners. "It's my chance, Jane," she'd said, her voice trembling with hope. "I could live comfortably, maybe even visit my sister in Bath." Miss Marple had nodded, her face kind, but her heart sank. Mrs. Price's savings, £5,000, were all she had. If Victor was a crook, as Miss Marple suspected, that money would vanish like smoke. The village clock chimed 9, pulling her from her thoughts. She stood, smoothing her tweed skirt, and decided to visit the village hall. The women's knitting circle met there every Tuesday, and it was the perfect place to hear gossip. Gossip, Miss Marple knew, was like a puzzle's missing piece. It often revealed what people tried to hide. She tucked her notebook into her handbag, a small leather thing she carried everywhere, and stepped into the crisp spring air. St. Mary Mead sparkled under the sun. Children skipped to school, their satchels bouncing. Mr. Harrow, the grocer, was stacking apples outside his shop, grumbling about the price of flour. Miss Marple nodded to him, her smile polite, and made her way to the hall. The old stone building sat at the village's heart, its windows hung with cheery red curtains. Inside, a dozen women sat in a circle, their needles clicking as they chatted. Mrs. Baker, the postmistress, was there, along with Miss Lucy, the schoolteacher, and Dolly, Bantry, Miss Marple's old friend. Dolly, with her loud laugh and bright scarves, was the only one who could match Miss Marple's knack for sniffing out trouble. "Jane, you're late," Dolly called, waving her over. "We're talking about that Langley fellow. Isn't he a dream?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, pulling out her knitting. "He's certainly charming," she said, her voice mild. She let her needles move, click, click, as she listened. The women were buzzing about Victor. Mrs. Baker said he'd bought a dozen stamps at the post office, claiming he was writing to investors in London. Miss Lucy gushed about his manners, how he'd helped her carry books to school. But not everyone was smitten. Mrs. Harrow, the grocer's wife, frowned as she knitted a lumpy sock. "My brother in London lost money to a man like that," she said. "Smooth talker, promised riches, then poof, gone with the cash. I don't trust this Langley one bit." The room went quiet. Mrs. Price, who'd just arrived, clutched her knitting tightly. "Oh, but Mr. Langley's different," she said, her voice high. "He gave me a contract. It's all proper. with fancy paper and a seal. Miss Marple's eyes flicked up, though her needles didn't pause. "A contract," she said gently. "How interesting. Might I see it, dear? I'm no expert, but I do like to read things over." Mrs. Price hesitated, her cheeks pink. "Well, I suppose. I'll bring it to your cottage later, Jane, but it's all above board, I'm sure." The other women nodded, but Miss Marple caught a few doubtful glances. Mrs. Harrow muttered something about too good to be true, and Dolly raised an eyebrow. Miss Marple kept knitting, her face serene, but her mind was racing. A contract could be a clue, or a trap. She'd seen fake papers before, in a case years ago when a swindler had fooled her friend's uncle with forged deeds. If Victor's contract was fishy, she'd spot it. As the knitting circle broke up, Dolly pulled Miss Marple aside. "You're up to something, Jane," she said, her eyes twinkling. "You've got that look, like when you figured out who stole the vicar's silver. What's wrong with this Langley chap?" Miss Marple smiled, folding her scarf. "Nothing yet, Dolly. But men who promise the moon often deliver dust. I'm just curious." Dolly laughed. "Curious, my foot? You're hunting, Jane Marple, and I'd bet my best hat you'll catch something." Miss Marple chuckled but didn't argue. She left the hall and headed to Mrs. Price's cottage, hoping to see that contract sooner rather than later. The widow's home was small, with a garden full of daisies and a gate that squeaked. Mrs. Price welcomed her in, flustered but pleased, and offered tea. As they sat in the tiny parlour, Miss Marple steered the talk to Victor. "He's so kind," Mrs. Price said, pouring tea. "He called yesterday, brought me a silk scarf, pure silk from Paris. Said it matched my eyes." She blushed, touching the scarf around her neck. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the scarf. It was pretty, but not expensive, probably bought cheap at a market. A small gift to win trust, she thought. "That's lovely," she said. "And the contract? Did you bring it out?" Mrs. Price fetched a folder from a drawer, her hands trembling. "Here it is. It's a bit long, but Mr. Langley said it's all standard." Miss Marple slipped on her glasses and opened the folder. The contract was thick, printed on heavy paper with a gold-embossed seal. At first glance, it looked impressive, full of big words like dividends and prospectus. But as she read, her lips tightened. The company name, Andy's Gold Ventures, sounded made up, like something from a bad novel. The dates were odd. One page mentioned a mine opening in 1920, another said 1925, and the fine print in tiny letters warned that investments carry risk and returns are not guaranteed. It was clever, she thought, designed to dazzle, while hiding the truth. She looked up, her face kind. "It's very detailed," she said, "but I'd sleep on it, dear. Money is hard to come by, and promises are easy to make." Mrs. Price bit her lip. "But Mr. Langley said the chance closes soon. He's only taking a few investors." Miss Marple patted her hand. "All the more reason to be careful. If it's real, it'll wait a day or two." Mrs. Price nodded, but her eyes were clouded with doubt. Miss Marple left the cottage, her mind buzzing. The contract was a sham, she was sure, but she needed proof. Victor was moving fast, and if Mrs. Price signed, her savings would be gone. As she walked home, she passed Rose Cottage. Victor's car was gone, but a shadow moved behind the curtains. She slowed, pretending to tie her shoe, but saw nothing more. Still, that shadow nagged her. Was it Victor's partner, the gruff voice she'd heard yesterday back at her cottage? Miss Marple brewed fresh tea and opened her notebook. She jotted down what she'd learned: the contract's flaws, Mrs. Price's scarf, the shadow at Rose Cottage. She added a note: check Andy's gold ventures. Her nephew Raymond hadn't replied yet, but she trusted he'd dig up something on Victor. For now, she'd keep watching. That afternoon she visited Mr. Harrow's shop, buying a loaf of bread and a tin of biscuits. As he wrapped her purchases, she mentioned Victor casually. "He's quite the talker," she said. "Reminds me of a man my cousin knew in Devon. Promised a fortune, then ran off with the money." Mr. Harrow grunted, his face sour. "Sounds familiar. A friend of mine in London got zero, lost his shirt to a scheme like that. I told the wife, don't trust Langley. Those pamphlets of his, too slick. I reckon he's a crook." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sharp. "I wonder if anyone's checked his story. A man like that leaves a trail." Mr. Harrow shrugged. "If he's a fraud, he'll slip up. They always do." Miss Marple smiled, tucking her purchases into her basket. "They do, indeed." As she left the shop, she saw Victor across the square, handing out more pamphlets. He spotted her and waved, his smile wide. She waved back, her face sweet, but her heart was steel. Victor was bold, but he was human, and humans made mistakes. She'd find his, and when she did, St. Mary Mead Beside Miss Marple returned home, her mind already spinning a plan. Victor's tea party had been a success, but the knitting circle had planted seeds of doubt. Mrs. Price's contract was a red flag, and Mr. Harrow's story backed her hunch. She needed to slow Victor down, give Raymond time to dig. Her next move was clear: spread the word, quietly, carefully. If the village turned wary, Victor's charm might falter. That evening, she wrote to Dolly, asking her to drop by. Dolly, with her big voice and bigger heart, could spread gossip faster than wildfire. If Miss Marple whispered a warning, Dolly would fan the flames. As she sealed the letter, her needles clicked, steady as a heartbeat. Victor Langley thought he'd outsmart St. Mary Mead, but he didn't know its sharpest mind. The game was on, and Miss Marple was playing to win. Chapter 3. A Dangerous Game. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village green. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting untouched on the table. Her sharp blue eyes were fixed on a letter from her nephew, Raymond West, which had arrived that morning. The words confirmed what she'd suspected. Victor Langley was no gentleman. Raymond's contacts in London found no trace of a Victor Langley in financial circles, but a conman named Vincent Lyle matched his description: tall, charming, with a knack for vanishing when the law closed in. Wanted for fraud in 3 counties, Vincent had swindled widows, retirees, and even a vicar out of their savings. Miss Marple folded the letter, her lips a thin line. Victor was Vincent, and St. Mary Mead was his latest hunting ground. She sipped her tea, the cup warm in her hands, and thought about the village. Victor's charm had worked fast. Mrs. Price was ready to hand over her life savings, and others, like Mr. Tompkins, were teetering on the edge. His gold mine scheme, with its glossy pamphlets and bold promises, was a trap, and Miss Marple knew she had to act before it snapped shut. Raymond's letter was proof, but it wasn't enough. She needed hard evidence, something to show the villagers and stop Victor in his tracks. Her gaze drifted to her notebook, where she jotted down clues. Victor's fake contract, the shadow, at Rose Cottage, the gruff voice of his partner. She added a new note. Vincent Lyle, alias Victor Langley. The name change was clever, but not clever enough. Miss Marple had seen swindlers before, like the man who'd fooled her friend's cousin in Bath with a fake shipping venture. That crook had been caught when a nosy neighbour spotted forged papers. Victor, she thought, would make a mistake too. She just had to find it. The village clock chimed 4, pulling her from her thoughts. Victor was holding another investment seminar at the village hall tonight, and Miss Marple planned to be there, not to invest, but to watch. Men like Victor thrived on trust, but they cracked under pressure. She slipped her notebook into her handbag, put on her tweed coat, and stepped into the cool evening air. St. Mary Mead was quiet, the streets lit by soft lamplight. Children's laughter had faded, replaced by the chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves. As she walked to the hall, she passed Rose Cottage. Victor's shiny car was parked outside, but the windows were dark. She slowed, pretending to adjust her scarf, and glanced at the cottage. No movement, no sound. Yet her skin prickled, as if someone was watching. She moved on, her steps steady, but her mind filed away the feeling. Victor wasn't alone, and his partner, whoever he was, made him doubly dangerous. The village hall was aglow, its red curtains framing windows full of warm light. Inside, a crowd buzzed, mostly older folk, but a few younger ones, like Tommy, the baker's boy, who'd been dazzled by Victor's tales. Miss Marple slipped in, taking a seat near the back. Her grey hair and mild smile made her blend in, just another old lady in a village of dreamers. But her eyes missed nothing. Victor stood at the front, his grey suit crisp, a red flower in his buttonhole. His voice rolled over the crowd, smooth as a river, as he described the gold mine. "A once-in-a-lifetime chance," he said, holding up a pamphlet. "The Andes are bursting with wealth, and I'm offering you a piece of it. But time's short, only a few spots left." The crowd murmured, excited. Mrs. Price, sitting near the front, clutched her purse, her face glowing. Mr. Tompkins nodded, scribbling notes. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in her lap, a habit to keep her hands busy while her mind worked. Victor's pitch was slick, but she caught a nervous tick, a quick tug at his cuff when someone asked about taxes. She leaned forward, her voice soft but clear. "Mr. Langley," she said, "could you tell us the mine's exact location? The Andes are quite large, I believe." The room went quiet. Victor's smile froze, just for a second, before he laughed. "A sharp question, Miss Marple. The mine's in a remote valley. Hard to pinpoint on a map, but I've seen it myself, glittering with promise." He winked and the crowd chuckled, charmed. But Miss Marple saw sweat bead on his brow. Her question had rattled him, and that was enough for now. She sat back, her face serene, as Victor wrapped up his talk. He handed out more pamphlets, shaking hands and flashing smiles. The villagers swarmed him, eager to sign up. Mrs. Price was first in line, her pen poised over a contract. Miss Marple waited until the crowd thinned, then stood, pretending to fumble with her scarf. She lingered near the front, where Victor was, packing his papers into a leather briefcase. The case had a lock, she noted, and he handled it carefully, as if it held secrets. As he turned to greet Mr. Tompkins, Miss Marple stepped closer, her movements slow but deliberate. She accidentally bumped the table, knocking a pen to the floor. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she said, bending to pick it up. Her eyes darted to the briefcase, catching a glimpse of a folder inside, labelled Andy's Gold. The folder was thick, with papers spilling out, and she spotted a name, Vincent, scrawled on a corner. Her heart quickened, but she kept her face blank, handing Victor the pen with a smile. "Thank you, Miss Marple," he said, his tone polite but his eyes cold. "You're quite observant, aren't you?" "Only when it matters," she replied, her voice sweet. She curtsied slightly and left the hall, her mind buzzing. The folder was a clue, maybe the key to Victor's scheme. If she could get a closer look, she might find proof. A forged letter, a fake deed, something to show the village. But the locked briefcase meant Victor was careful. She'd need to be cleverer. Outside the night was crisp, stars twinkling above the village. Miss Marple walked home, her steps slow, but her thoughts racing. She passed the Blue Boar pub, where laughter spilled out, and saw Tommy, the baker's boy, showing off a pamphlet to his friends. Her heart sank. Victor's net was wide, catching young and old alike. She had to move fast before more villagers fell into his trap. Back at her cottage, she lit a lamp and opened her notebook. She wrote, "Folder in briefcase, labelled Andy's Gold, name Vincent." She tapped her pen, thinking. The folder might hold fake contracts or letters, like the ones Mrs. Price had shown her. Or it could be worse. Proof of bigger crimes. Raymond's letter had mentioned Vincent Lyle's frauds, but also a rumour of blackmail. Was Victor squeezing his victims for more than money? The thought chilled her, but it fit. Men like Victor didn't stop at theft. They preyed on fear, shame, anything to keep their marks quiet. She brewed a fresh pot of tea, the kettle's whistle steadying her nerves. As she sipped, she planned her next move. Confronting Victor was too risky. He was smooth and the village loved him. Instead, she'd dig deeper, starting with that folder. She couldn't break into Rose Cottage. That was a job for younger, bolder folk. But she could watch and wait. Victor would slip, and when he did, she'd be ready. The next morning, Miss Marple visited Dolly Bantry, her friend with a knack for gossip. Dolly's house was grand, with rose gardens and a parlour full of chintz. Over tea and scones, Miss Marple shared her worries, keeping her voice low. "I'm not saying Mr. Langley's a crook," she said, "but his promises are awfully big. Mrs. Price could lose everything." Dolly's eyes widened. "Good heavens, Jane, you think he's a swindler?" "I think we should be careful," Miss Marple said. "Could you mention it to a few people? Quietly, of course. Just a word about checking contracts, maybe asking questions." Dolly grinned, catching on. "Leave it to me. I'll have the village buzzing by supper." Miss Marple smiled, knowing Dolly's buzz would spread doubt like wildfire. If the villagers hesitated, Victor might get nervous, and nervous men made mistakes. She left Dolly's house and headed to the post office, where Mrs. Baker was, sorting mail. Miss Marple bought a stamp and dropped a hint about Victor's seminar, saying she'd heard of similar schemes going sour. Mrs. Baker, sharp as a tack, promised to tell her husband, who'd spread the word at the pub. By afternoon, the village was whispering. Miss Marple heard it at the grocer's, where Mr. Harrow muttered about shady deals, and at the duck pond, where two women debated Victor's pamphlets. Mrs. Price, though, was still smitten, waving off doubts with a nervous laugh. Miss Marple didn't push. She knew trust died slowly, especially when charm was involved. That evening, she took a walk past Rose Cottage, her umbrella up against a light drizzle. Victor's car was there, and a light glowed inside. She paused, pretending to fix her shoe, and heard voices, Victor's smooth tone and the gruff one she'd caught before. "Need to wrap this up," the gruff voice said. "They're asking questions." "Let them ask," Victor snapped. "By Friday, we're gone." Miss Marple's heart raced. Friday was 2 days away. Victor was planning to flee with the village's money in his pocket. She straightened, her face calm, and walked home. The drizzle had stopped, leaving the air fresh and cool. In her cottage, she lit a fire and opened her notebook, adding, "Victor plans to leave Friday." Time was short, but she had an edge. He didn't know she was on to him. She wrote to Raymond again, asking for any news on Vincent Lyle's partners. A gruff-voiced man might be in police records, and if she could name him, she'd have more to take to Constable Reed, the young officer who patrolled St. Mary Mead. Reed was green, but he respected her thanks to a case last year when she'd helped catch a thief. If she could show him proof, he'd act. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind a web of plans. Victor's seminar had shown his confidence, but her question had shaken him. The folder in his briefcase was her target, and Dolly's gossip was stirring doubt. She'd keep pushing quietly until Victor's mask slipped. Men like him, she knew, were clever but not invincible. They underestimated small villages and old ladies. Her needles clicked, a steady rhythm in the quiet cottage. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept, unaware of the danger in its midst. But Miss Marple was awake, her eyes bright with purpose. Victor Langley, or Vincent Lyle, thought he'd outsmart them all. He was wrong. The game was tightening, and Miss Marple was one move ahead. Chapter 4. The First Victim. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, curling around the village like a soft blanket. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, her sharp blue eyes scanning the quiet lane. Her hands, usually busy with knitting, were still clutching a letter she'd written but not yet sent. The village felt heavy today, as if it sensed the trouble brewing. Victor Langley, or Vincent Lyle as her nephew's letter had named him, was tightening his grip on St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple knew time was slipping away. Yesterday's seminar had been a triumph for Victor. His smooth talk and glossy pamphlets had lured more villagers into his gold mine scheme. Mrs. Price, the widow, had signed her contract, handing over her life's savings, £5,000. Others, like Mr. Tompkins, were close to following. Miss Marple had planted seeds of doubt through Dolly Bantry's gossip and her own gentle warnings. But Victor's charm was strong. She'd overheard him at the seminar, planning to flee by Friday, tomorrow. If she didn't act fast, the village would lose everything. Her notebook lay open on the table, filled with clues. Vincent Lyle's criminal past, the fake contract, the locked briefcase with its Andy's gold folder, the gruff-voiced partner, and Victor's plan to escape. She'd written to her nephew, Raymond, for more on Lyle's accomplices. But no reply had come yet. Constable Reed, the young officer, might help, but he'd need solid proof. Miss Marple sipped her tea, the cup warm against her fingers, and thought hard. Proof was in that briefcase, she was sure, but getting to it was like catching a fox, tricky and dangerous. A sharp cry broke her thoughts. She looked out to see a small crowd in the village square, near the war memorial. Her heart quickened. Slipping on her coat and grabbing her umbrella, she hurried out, her steps quick despite her age. The mist was thinning, revealing a knot of villagers. Mrs. Baker, Mr. Harrow, and young Tommy, the baker's boy, gathered around someone on the ground. As Miss Marple drew closer, she saw Mrs. Price, pale and crumpled, clutching a crumpled letter. Dr. Haydock, the village doctor, knelt beside her, his face grim. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady but soft. Mrs. Baker turned, her eyes wide. "It's Mrs. Price, Jane. She collapsed right here in the square. Found her sobbing, holding that letter." Miss Marple knelt, ignoring the damp cobblestones. "Edith, dear," she said, touching Mrs. Price's hand. "Can you hear me?" Mrs. Price's eyes fluttered, red from crying. "It's gone, Jane," she whispered. "My money, all gone." Dr. Haydock helped her sit up, his voice low. "She's had a shock. Her heart's weak, needs rest. I'll take her home." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze on the letter in Mrs. Price's hand. It was on Victor's fancy paper, with the gold-embossed seal of Andy's Gold Ventures. She helped Dr. Haydock lift Mrs. Price, who leaned heavily on her arm. The crowd parted, whispering, as they walked to Mrs. Price's cottage. Miss Marple's mind raced. The letter was no surprise, but seeing Mrs. Price broken like this turned her suspicion into fire. Victor wasn't just a thief. He was a wrecker of lives. At the cottage, Dr. Haydock settled Mrs. Price into an armchair, giving her a pill for her heart. Miss Marple brewed tea, her hands steady though her heart ached. She sat beside Mrs. Price, who clutched the letter like a lifeline. "May I see it, dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Price nodded, her hands trembling. The letter was short, typed in crisp black ink. "Dear Mrs. Price, regrettably, due to unforeseen issues with Andy's Gold Ventures, your investment is temporarily tied up. We assure you every effort is being made to resolve this. Please await further correspondence. Yours, sincerely, Victor Langley." Miss Marple's lips tightened. The words were vague, designed to stall, but they'd crushed Mrs. Price. She patted the widow's hand. "Rest now, Edith. We'll sort this out." Dr. Haydock pulled Miss Marple aside, his voice low. "Her heart's taken a beating, Jane. This shock could have killed her. Whatever Langley's done, it's more than money." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm, but her eyes steel. "He's done enough damage. It stops here." She left the cottage, the letter tucked in her handbag. The village square was quiet now, the crowd gone, but the air felt heavy. Miss Marple walked to the Blue Boar pub, where Mr. Harrow was nursing a pint. She sat nearby, ordering a lemonade, and mentioned Mrs. Price's collapse. "That letter from Langley," she said, "broke her heart. I wonder if others got one. Mr. Harrow's face darkened. He's a snake, Jane. My friend in London warned me. Men like Langley take your money and run. I told Tompkins not to sign, but he's stubborn. Miss Marple nodded, her voice soft. Perhaps you could warn others. Quietly, of course. No need to panic anyone. Mr. Harrow grunted, but she saw the spark in his eyes. He'd spread the word, and fast. She left the pub, her steps slow but purposeful. The village was waking up. Children played by the duck pond, and Mrs. Baker swept her stoop. Miss Marple passed Rose Cottage, where Victor's car was gone. A curtain twitched, and she caught a glimpse of a man, not Victor, but stocky, with a flat cap. The partner, she thought, her pulse quickening. She kept walking, her face serene, but her mind filed away the image. Back at her cottage, she opened her notebook and added, Mrs. Price collapsed. Letter from Victor, stocky man at Rose Cottage. She reread the letter, its words cold and calculated. It was a stalling tactic, meant to keep Mrs. Price quiet while Victor prepared to flee. Friday, tomorrow, was his deadline. She had one day to stop him. She visited Dolly Bantry, knowing her friend's gossip could slow Victor's scheme. Dolly's parlour was bright, smelling of roses and fresh cake. Over tea, Miss Marple shared the news of Mrs. Price's collapse, keeping her tone gentle. Edith's lost everything, she said. That Langley's letter was cruel. I wonder if others are at risk. Dolly gasped, her teacup clattering. Good heavens, Jane, he's a monster. I'll tell everyone, Mrs. Baker, the vicar's wife, even old Mrs. Lucy. They won't touch his scheme now. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes kind. Just a word, Dolly. We don't want to scare anyone, just caution them. Dolly nodded, already planning her attack. Miss Marple left, knowing the village would buzz by evening. Doubt was spreading, and Victor would feel it. Nervous men, she knew, made mistakes. She'd seen it years ago, when a swindler in Devon had panicked and left a forged cheque behind. Victor's mistake was coming. She just had to push him toward it. That afternoon, she walked to the village hall, where Victor had posted a notice for a final investment round tomorrow morning. The words were bold, urging people to act now or miss out. Miss Marple's lips pursed. It was a desperate move, proof he was rushing to grab what he could before bolting. She lingered, pretending to read the notice, when Tommy, the baker's boy, ran up, his face red. Miss Marple, did you hear? He said, breathless. Mrs. Price is sick, and folks say Langley's to blame. Is it true? She patted his arm, her voice soft. It's a sad business, Tommy. Best to be careful with money, don't you think? Tell your pa to check any papers before signing. Tommy nodded, dashing off. Miss Marple knew his father, the baker, would listen. The village was turning slowly but surely. She headed home, her umbrella tapping the cobblestones, and thought about Constable Reed. He was young, eager, but needed proof to act. The letter and contract were suspicious, but not enough. The Andes gold folder in Victor's briefcase was her best bet, but getting to it meant getting close to him. As evening fell, Miss Marple lit a fire in her cottage, the crackle soothing her nerves. She opened her notebook, reviewing her clues. Mrs. Price's collapse was a warning. Victor's scheme wasn't just theft, it was deadly. Dr. Haydock's words echoed. This could have killed her. Miss Marple's heart hardened. She dealt with crooks before, like the man who'd swindled her cousin's friend in London. But Victor was worse. He didn't care who he hurt, as long as his pockets were full. She wrote to Raymond again, asking for any word on Vincent Lyle's partners, especially a stocky man with a gruff voice. She sealed the letter, her hand steady, and planned her next move. Victor's final round was tomorrow, his last chance to fleece the village before fleeing. She'd go, not to invest, but to watch. If she could rattle him again, like she had at the seminar, he might slip, leave a paper behind, say too much. Men under pressure, she knew, were careless. A knock at the door startled her. It was Dolly, her face flushed. "Jane, it's working," she said, stepping inside. "Mrs. Baker's telling everyone about Mrs. Price, and Mr. Tompkins is holding off signing. Langley's furious. Saw him at the pub, snapping at Tommy." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Good. Let him squirm. But we must be careful, Dolly. He's not done yet." Dolly nodded, her scarf bobbing. "You're a wonder, Jane. If he's a crook, you'll catch him." Miss Marple smiled, offering Dolly a scone. After her friend left, she sat by the fire, her needles clicking at last. The village was waking up, but Victor was cunning. Tomorrow's meeting would be his final play, and hers. She thought of Mrs. Price, pale and broken, and her resolve sharpened. Victor Langley had hurt her village, her people. He'd pay for it, not with violence, but with truth. Outside, St. Mary Mead slept under a starry sky, unaware of the battle in its midst. Miss Marple's cottage glowed softly, a beacon of quiet strength. She closed her notebook, her mind a map of clues and plans. Tomorrow, she'd face Victor again, her eyes sharp, her heart steady. The game was nearing its end, and Miss Marple was ready to win. Chapter 5. A Trap is Set. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a pink glow, chasing away the morning mist. Miss Jane Marple sat at her kitchen table, her tea gone cold. Her sharp blue eyes were fixed on her notebook, where clues about Victor, Langley, or Vincent Lyle, the conman, formed a web of danger. Mrs. Price's collapse yesterday, clutching Victor's cruel letter, had lit a fire in Miss Marple's heart. The widow's savings were gone, her health shattered, and Victor was set to flee tomorrow with the village's money. Today was his final investment round at the village hall, his last chance to swindle more victims. Miss Marple knew it was her last chance to stop him. Her notebook told the story. Vincent Lyle's criminal past, the fake Andy's gold, contract, the locked briefcase with its secret folder, the gruff-voiced partner, and Victor's plan to escape by Friday. Tomorrow, she'd spread doubt through Dolly Bantry's gossip, and the village was wary, but Victor's charm still held sway. Mrs. Price was his first victim, but others, like Mr. Tompkins, teetered on the edge. Miss Marple needed proof, something solid, to show Constable Reed and unmask Victor before he vanished. She stood, smoothing her tweed skirt, and glanced at the clock. It was 7, and the village was stirring. Children's laughter drifted from the green, and Mr. Harrow's shop was already open, apples gleaming in the sun. Miss Marple's mind turned to the briefcase. That Andy's gold folder glimpsed at the seminar was her target. If it held forged papers or proof of Vincent Lyle's crimes, she could end this. But the lock meant Victor was careful, and his partner, stocky, gruff, seen at Rose Cottage, made him doubly dangerous. She needed a plan, one as clever as Victor himself. An idea sparked. Victor thrived on trust, but he was vain, drawn to anyone who seemed to believe his lies. If she pretended to invest, he might let his guard down. She could get close, ask questions, maybe glimpse that folder again. It was risky. Victor wasn't a fool, but Miss Marple had outwitted sharper men. Years ago, in London, she'd helped catch a swindler by playing the dotty old lady, her questions tripping him up. Victor, she thought, would underestimate her too. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Pose as investor. Get close to briefcase." Then she dressed, choosing a plain grey coat and her best lace cap to look harmless. Her handbag held her notebook, a pencil, and Raymond's letter naming Vincent Lyle. No reply had come to her latest query about Lyle's partner, but she trusted Raymond was digging. For now, she'd work alone. A knock at the door startled her. It was Dolly Bantry, her scarf bright as a parrot. "Jane, the village is buzzing," Dolly said, stepping inside. "Mrs. Price's collapse has everyone spooked. Mr. Tompkins tore up his contract, and Mrs. Baker's husband won't touch Langley's scheme. He's losing ground." Miss Marple poured tea, her smile faint. "That's good, Dolly, but he's not beaten. Today's his last push. I'm going to the hall to keep an eye on him." Dolly's eyes widened. "You're up to something. Jane Marple, be careful. That man's a snake." "I'll be fine," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "But could you tell Mrs. Baker to watch Rose Cottage? If anyone comes or goes, I'd like to know." Dolly nodded, sipping her tea. "You're a fox, Jane. I'll do it." After Dolly left, Miss Marple walked to the village hall. The sun was higher now, warming the cobblestones. The hall's notice board still boasted Victor's final round poster, its bold letters urging haste. A small crowd gathered, fewer than before, thanks to Dolly's gossip, but still too many. Miss Marple spotted Mrs. Lucy, the schoolteacher, and young Tommy, the baker's boy, both holding pamphlets. Her heart sank. Victor's net was shrinking, but it was still wide. She approached Mrs. Lucy, her smile kind. "Thinking of investing, dear?" she asked. Mrs. Lucy blushed. "Maybe a little. Mr. Langley says it's safe, and I could use the money for new books." Miss Marple patted her arm. "Check the papers carefully, dear. Promises are cheap, but mistakes are costly." Mrs. Lucy nodded, her brow creasing. Miss Marple moved on, planting similar seeds with Tommy and an old couple. By the time Victor arrived, driving his shiny car, the crowd was restless, whispering doubts. He stepped out, his grey suit crisp, a red flower in his buttonhole. His smile was wide, but Miss Marple caught a tightness in his jaw. He was feeling the pressure. He spotted her and strode over, his cane tapping. "Miss Marple, I hoped you'd come. Ready to join our venture?" She smiled, her eyes soft. "Perhaps, Mr. Langley. I've a small inheritance, nothing grand, but I'm curious. Could we talk privately? I'm a bit shy about money." Victor's eyes gleamed, sensing an easy mark. "Of course. Come to Rose Cottage this afternoon, say 2:00. I'll explain everything." "Thank you," she said, curtsying slightly. "I do like things clear." He bowed, his smile smug, and moved to greet the crowd. Miss Marple watched him, her heart steady. The trap was set. She'd lured him, not the other way around. At Rose Cottage, alone with his papers, he might slip. She joined the seminar, taking a back seat, her needles clicking as Victor spoke. His pitch was desperate now, his voice louder, promising guaranteed returns. The crowd listened, but fewer hands went up to sign. Dolly's gossip and Mrs. Price's collapse had done their work. After the seminar, Miss Marple lingered, pretending to misplace her glove. Victor was packing his briefcase, his movements quick. She glimpsed the Andes gold folder again, its edges worn. He locked the case, his eyes darting to her. "Lost something, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Just my glove," she said, smiling. "Old age, you know." He relaxed, chuckling, and left the hall. Miss Marple found her glove, tucked in her pocket all along, and walked home, her mind buzzing. 2 o'clock at Rose Cottage was her chance. She'd ask questions, poke at his story, and watch for mistakes. If she could see that folder, or, better, get him to open the briefcase, she'd have what she needed. At home, she ate a light lunch of soup and bread, her thoughts on Victor. His partner worried her. The stocky man at Rose Cottage, with his gruff voice, was a shadow she couldn't place. Was he muscle, keeping Victor safe, or another crook, splitting the profits? She wrote in her notebook, "Meeting at Rose Cottage, 2 p.m, watch for partner." Then she rested, knowing she'd need her wits sharp. At 1:30 she set out, her umbrella tapping the lane. Rose Cottage looked charming, its ivy green and windows sparkling. But Miss Marple felt a chill. She knocked, and Victor opened the door, his smile wide. "Miss Marple, welcome! Come in, let's talk riches." The parlour was cosy, with a fire crackling and tea on a tray. Victor's briefcase sat on a desk, its lock glinting. No sign of the partner, but a door to the back was ajar, and Miss Marple caught a whiff of tobacco. Someone was near, listening. She sat, her hands folded, and let Victor talk. He spun his gold mine tale, his voice smooth, promising her tenfold returns for a modest sum. She nodded, her face eager. "It sounds wonderful, Mr. Langley, but I'm a simple woman. Could you show me the papers? I like to see things in black and white." Victor hesitated, his smile stiff. "Of course, the contract's standard, but I'll fetch it." He stood, moving to the desk. Miss Marple leaned forward, asking, "And your associates, are they in London? I'd feel safer knowing who's behind this." His hand paused on the briefcase. "Just me and a few silent partners," he said, his tone clipped. "Nothing to worry about." She pressed, her voice sweet. "And the mine's output? How much gold exactly? My nephew reads about such things." Victor's jaw twitched. "Hundreds of ounces monthly," he snapped, unlocking the briefcase. He pulled out a contract, but Miss Marple glimpsed the Andes gold folder, its papers spilling. She kept talking, asking about taxes, permits, anything to keep him off balance. He answered, his voice tight, and left the briefcase open. When he stepped to the kitchen for tea, Miss Marple acted. She leaned over, her movements slow, and peered at the folder. A letterhead caught her eye, Andes Gold Ventures, but the address was a postbox in London, not a mine. Another paper had Vincent Lyle's name, crossed out, and a train ticket to London, dated tomorrow. Her heart raced. Proof at last! Victor returned, and she sat back smiling. "Your tea smells lovely," she said, taking a cup. He relaxed, thinking her fooled. They chatted, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. The folder held lies, forged, papers, fake names. If she could get one to Constable Reed, Victor was done. She left Rose Cottage, promising to think over investing. Victor's smile was smug, but his eyes were wary. Miss Marple walked home, her umbrella steady, her heart pounding. The train ticket meant Victor was fleeing tomorrow, as she'd overheard. The letterhead and Lyle's name tied him to the fraud. She needed to act tonight, before he vanished. At her cottage, she wrote to Constable Reed, asking him to meet her tomorrow morning. She described the folder, the ticket and Vincent Lyle's name, urging him to watch Rose Cottage. She sealed the letter, her hands steady, and slipped it into her mailbox for the early post. Then she sat by the fire, her needles clicking, and planned. Victor's meeting tomorrow was her last chance to rattle him. If Reed could catch him with the briefcase, the game was over. Outside, St. Mary Mead glowed under the moon, its quiet hiding a storm. Miss Marple's cottage was a beacon, her mind a trap closing around Victor. He'd hurt Mrs. Price, threatened her village, but he'd underestimated Jane Marple. Tomorrow she'd spring her trap, and Vincent Lyle would fall. Chapter 6. The Confrontation. The morning sun climbed over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a golden glow. Miss Jane Marple stood by her cottage window, her sharp blue eyes scanning the quiet lane. Her heart beat steady, but her mind raced like a river. Today was the day. Victor Langley, or Vincent Lyle, the con man who'd preyed on her village, was set to flee with stolen savings. His final investment round had failed yesterday, thanks to her whispers and Dolly Bantry's gossip, but he was still dangerous. Mrs. Price's collapse, her life's savings gone, had heartened Miss Marple's resolve. Victor's game ended now. Her notebook lay open on the table, a map of clues. Vincent Lyle's criminal past, the fake Andy's Gold contract, the locked briefcase with its secret folder, the gruff-voiced partner, and the train ticket to London she'd glimpsed at Rose Cottage. Yesterday's visit to Victor's parlour had been her boldest move. Posing as an investor, she'd seen proof, a forged letterhead, Lyle's name, and that ticket dated for today. She'd written to Constable Reed, urging him to watch Victor, and now she waited, her tea cooling, for the trap to spring. The village clock chimed 8, stirring her from her thoughts. She smoothed her tweed skirt, tucked her notebook into her handbag, and put on her grey coat. Her lace cap made her look like any old lady, but her eyes were steel. Victor thought he'd outsmarted St. Mary Mead, but he didn't know Jane Marple. She'd faced crooks before, a swindler in Bath, a thief in London, and won by being patient, sharp, and underestimated. Victor was no different. He'd slip, and she'd be there. She stepped into the crisp air, the village sparkling under, the sun. Children played by the duck pond, their laughter bright. Mr. Harrow's shop was open, apples stacked neatly. Miss Marple nodded to Mrs. Baker, sweeping her stoop, and headed to the village hall. No seminar today. Victor's charm had faltered. But she'd heard he was meeting last-minute investors at Rose Cottage. That was her chance. If Constable Reed was ready, they could catch him with the briefcase, its secrets exposed as she passed Rose Cottage. Victor's shiny car sat in the drive, its chrome gleaming. A curtain twitched. and she glimpsed the stocky man, Victor's partner, with his flat cap and gruff voice. Her pulse quickened, but she kept walking, her umbrella tapping the cobblestones. The partner worried her. Was he just a lookout or something worse? She'd overheard them planning to flee, and men on the run were desperate. She filed the thought away, her face serene. At the village hall, a small crowd lingered, whispering about Mrs. Price. Dolly Bantry was there, her scarf a splash of red. She pulled Miss Marple aside, her voice low. "Jane, it's working. Nobody signed yesterday. Your warning's stuck. But Langley's at Rose Cottage, pushing hard. Mrs. Lucy's thinking of going." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "We can't. Let him take more. Dolly, could you keep an eye on the cottage? If you see Constable Reed, tell him I'm there." Dolly's eyes widened. "You're going in? Jane, he's dangerous." "I'll be careful," Miss Marple said, her smile faint. "But he's cornered, and cornered men make mistakes." Dolly nodded, squeezing her hand. Miss Marple walked to Rose Cottage, her steps slow but sure. The village felt heavy, as if it sensed the storm brewing. She knocked on Victor's door, her heart steady. He opened it, his smile wide but his eyes tired, like a fox caught in a trap. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing, "come to invest at last? You're just in time." She curtsied, her voice soft. "I'm still thinking, Mr. Langley. May I ask a few more questions? My nephew's fussy about money." His smile tightened, but he ushered her in. The parlour was tidy, the fire crackling, but the air felt thick. The briefcase sat on the desk, its lock glinting. No sign of the partner, but the back door was ajar, and Miss Marple caught a whiff of tobacco. Someone was close, listening. She sat, her hands folded, and let Victor talk. He spun his gold mine tale, his voice smooth but rushed, promising riches by next year. She nodded, her face eager. "It sounds grand," she said, "but my nephew checked on Andy's gold ventures. He found no record in London. Could you show me proof? A letter, perhaps?" Victor's hand froze on his teacup. "Your nephew's? Mistaken," he said, his tone sharp. "The company's new, not listed yet." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes wide. "Oh? But I saw a letterhead yesterday with a London address. Just a postbox, though. Odd for a big mine, don't you think?" His jaw twitched and sweat beaded on his brow. "You're quite the detective, Miss Marple," he said, forcing a laugh. "That's just a temporary office," she pressed, her voice sweet. "And your name? Vincent, was it? I saw it on a paper. My nephew mentioned a Vincent Lyle, a businessman." Victor's face paled. He stood, his cane clattering to the floor. "You've been snooping," he snapped, his charm gone. "What do you know?" Miss Marple stayed calm, her hands still. "Enough, Mr. Lyle. Your contract's fake, your mine's a lie, and you're leaving today with Mrs. Price's money. I've told Constable Reed, and he's watching." Victor lunged, his hand grabbing her wrist. "You meddling old fool!" he hissed. "You'll ruin everything." Before she could answer, a shout came from the door. "Langley, stop!" "Constable!" Reed burst in, his truncheon raised. He'd been hiding nearby, tipped off by Dolly. Victor froze, his grip loosening. Miss Marple pulled free, her heart pounding but her face calm. "Constable," she said, "check his briefcase." The folder marked Andy's Gold has proof, forged papers, his real name, and a train ticket for today. Reed hesitated, then grabbed the briefcase. Victor lunged again, but Reed was faster, pinning him against the wall. "Stay put, Langley," he growled. He unlocked the case. Victor had left the key in his haste and pulled out the folder. Miss Marple leaned over, pointing. To the letterhead, Lyle's name and the ticket. "It's all there," she said. "Vincent Lyle, wanted for fraud. He's been fleecing the village." Victor's shoulders slumped, his fight gone. "You're too clever, old woman," he muttered. Reed cuffed him, his face grim. "You're under arrest, Lyle. Fraud, theft, and assault. Let's go." As Reed led Victor out, Miss Marple heard a scuffle in the back. The stocky partner bolted through the garden, but Reed shouted, and Tommy, the baker's boy, tackled him. "Got him!" Tommy yelled, grinning. Miss Marple smiled faintly. St. Mary Mead looked after its own. At the police station, Reed sorted through the folder, finding fake contracts, forged letters, and a list of victims, Mrs. Price, Mr. Tompkins, and others. Victor's partner, a thug named Harry Cobb, confessed to helping with the scams. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded as Reed took her statement. "You've saved the village, Miss Marple," he said, shaking his head. "How'd you know?" "People talk, Constable," she said, her eyes twinkling, "and I listen." She left the station, the sun high now, and walked home. The village buzzed, Mrs. Baker spreading the news, Dolly hugging everyone, Tommy boasting about his tackle. Miss Marple slipped into her cottage, brewing fresh tea. Her notebook was full, the case closed, but her heart was heavy. Money was partly recovered. Victor's accounts held some cash, but not all. The widow's health was frail, and others had lost trust. She sat by the fire, her needles clicking, and thought of Victor. He'd been clever, but vain, thinking a village of simple folk couldn't stop him. She'd seen his kind before, a swindler in Devon, a blackmailer in London. They all fell, tripped by their own greed. Her questions, her meddling, had rattled him, and St. Mary Mead's spirit, Dolly's gossip, Tommy's bravery, Reed's quick action, had finished the job. A knock came. It was Dolly, her face bright. "Jane, you're a hero! The vicar's planning a tea for you, and Mrs. Price wants to thank you." Miss Marple smiled, offering a scone. "No need, Dolly. I just did what was right." Dolly laughed, settling in. As they chatted, Miss Marple's needles moved, a steady rhythm. Outside, St. Mary Mead sparkled, its heart unbroken. Victor Langley was gone, his lies exposed, but Miss Marple knew other dangers would come. She'd be ready, her eyes sharp, her village safe. The game was over, and Jane Marple had won. Chapter 7. Justice and Reflection. The afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a warm golden light, softening the edges of the village's stone cottages. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy parlour, a cup of tea steaming beside her. The fire crackled, gently, and her knitting needles clicked in a steady rhythm, working on a pale pink scarf. The village was quiet now, its heart slowly healing after the storm of Victor Langley's deceit. Vincent Lyle, as he was truly named, was gone. Arrested yesterday by Constable Reed, his lies exposed by Miss Marple's sharp mind. But the scars he'd left lingered, and Miss Marple's thoughts were heavy as she sipped her tea. Her notebook lay closed on the table, its pages full of clues that had unravelled Victor's scheme. His criminal past as Vincent Lyle, the fake Endy's gold contract, the locked briefcase with its forged papers, the gruff-voiced partner, and the train ticket proving his plan to flee. Mrs. Price's collapse, her savings stolen, had been the spark that drove Miss Marple to act. Yesterday's confrontation at Rose Cottage, where she'd faced Victor, baited him with questions, and watched Reed cuff him, had ended the game. Victor's partner, Harry Cobb, was caught too, thanks to young Tommy's quick tackle. The village was safe, but not untouched. Miss Marple set her knitting down, her blue eyes drifting to the window. The village green sparkled, children playing by the duck pond, their laughter a balm to her heart. Mrs. Baker swept her stoop, waving to Mr. Harrow, who stacked apples outside his shop. Life was returning to its gentle rhythm, but Miss Marple knew the wounds ran deep. Mrs. Price, frail and heartbroken, had lost most of her savings. Others, like Mr. Tompkins and Mrs. Lucy, had narrowly escaped but felt foolish for trusting Victor's charm. The village's trust, so freely given, had been bruised. She stood, smoothing her tweed skirt, and opened her notebook one last time. She added a final entry. Victor Langley, alias Vincent Lyle, arrested. Harry Cobb, accomplice, in custody. Some funds recovered. Constable Reed had searched Victor's accounts, finding a portion of Mrs. Price's £5,000, about 3,000 hidden in a London bank. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Reed had promised to return it to her, and Miss Marple had quietly arranged for the church to help with the rest. St. Mary Mead looked after its own. A knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Dolly Bantry, her bright red scarf like a flag of cheer. "Jane, you're the talk of the village," Dolly said, stepping inside. "The vicar's planning a tea to thank you, and Mrs. Price keeps saying you're an angel. How do you do it?" Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea. "I just listen, Dolly. People tell their own stories if you pay attention." Dolly laughed, taking a scone. "Listen, my foot. You're a hunter, Jane Marple, and you bagged that snake Langley. Reed says they found a list of victims in his briefcase. Dozens, from here to London. You saved us all." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, but her heart was heavy. "Not all, Dolly. Edith Price paid a high price. I wish I'd been faster." Dolly's face softened. "You did more than anyone, Jane. She'll be all right, with the village behind her." They chatted, the fire warming the room, and Miss Marple felt a spark of comfort. Dolly's gossip had helped spread doubt, slowing Victor's scheme. Tommy's bravery, Reed's quick action, and the village's spirit had finished it. She wasn't alone in this victory, and that eased her mind. After Dolly left, promising to organise the vicar's tea, Miss Marple sat back, her needles clicking again. She thought of Victor, now in a cell, his smug smile gone. He'd been clever, with his polished suits and silver tongue, but vain, thinking. A village of simple folk couldn't stop him. She'd seen his kind before. A swindler in Devon who'd fooled her cousin's friend. A blackmailer in London caught by a careless note. They all fell, tripped by their own greed. Victor's mistake was underestimating her. Her questions at Rose Cottage, sharp and steady, had rattled him, and his lunge, grabbing her wrist in a flash of panic, had sealed his fate. She sipped her tea, the cup warm in her hands, and reflected on the village. St. Mary Mead was small, its lanes winding like threads in a quilt, but its heart was strong. Mrs. Baker's whispers, Mr. Harrow's warnings, even young Tommy's tackle, they'd all played a part. Miss Marple had led the charge, but the village had stood with her. That was its power, she thought, the quiet strength of people who cared. A memory surfaced from years ago when she'd helped catch a thief in London. Her nephew, Raymond, had laughed, calling her a detective in a lace cap. She'd smiled then, as now, knowing the truth. She wasn't a detective, just a woman who saw patterns in people like stitches in her knitting. Victor's pattern, charm, lies, greed, had been clear from the start. His glossy pamphlets, his silk scarves, his two perfect stories, they'd all screamed danger to her sharp eyes. She stood, moving to the window. The sun was dipping, painting the sky pink. Mrs. Price's cottage, just down the lane, was lit, softly, a sign she was resting. Miss Marple had visited her yesterday, after Victor's arrest, bringing a basket of scones and jam. Mrs. Price had wept, clutching her hand, thanking her for saving what was left of her money. "I was so foolish, Jane," she'd said. "He seemed so kind." "Kindness can hide cruelty," Miss Marple had replied, her voice gentle. "But you're safe now." She'd promised to check on her daily, and the church was raising funds to help her rebuild. Mrs. Price's health was frail, but her spirit was stirring, lifted by the village's care. Miss Marple's heart warmed at the thought. Victor had hurt them, but he hadn't broken them. A knock came again. It was Constable Reed, his young face flushed with pride. "Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you," he said, stepping inside. "Lyles confessed. Fraud, theft, the lot. His partner's talking too. We've got enough to keep them locked up for years." Miss Marple offered him tea, her smile kind. "You did fine work, Constable. That tackle at Rose Cottage was quick thinking." Reed blushed, sipping his tea. "Couldn't have done it without you, ma'am. That folder you pointed out, it had everything. Fake contracts, bank details, even letters blackmailing folks to stay quiet. Lyle's done this in 5 towns before. Us." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Blackmail, as she'd suspected. Victor hadn't just stolen money. He'd preyed on fear, threatening to ruin reputations if victims spoke. It explained Mrs. Price's panic, her silence even after the letter. "Will the others get their money back?" she asked. "Some," Reed said. "Lyle's accounts are frozen, but he's spent a lot. Mrs. Price'll get most of hers, thanks to you." Miss Marple nodded, her heart easing. "Good. Keep an eye on her, Constable. She's fragile," Reed promised, then left, his boots loud on the path. Miss Marple sat back, her needles moving faster. The case was closed, but her mind lingered on Victor. He'd been a predator, cloaked in charm, and St. Mary Mead had been his prey. She'd stopped him, but others like him were out there, waiting for trusting towns. The thought chilled her, but it also sharpened her resolve. She'd be ready, her eyes open, her village safe. She thought of her notebook, now a record of victory. Each clue, the contract, the ticket, the folder, had been a step toward justice. She'd risked much, facing Victor alone at Rose Cottage, but fear hadn't stopped her. Years ago, in a case in Bath, she'd faced a crook who'd threatened, her with a knife. She talked him down, her voice calm until help arrived. Victor's lunge had been no different. Panic, not strength. She'd won by staying steady, her mind sharper than his fists. The clock chimed 6, and Miss Marple stood, lighting a lamp. The village was settling into evening, lamps glowing in windows like stars. She walked to Mrs. Price's cottage, a basket of muffins in hand. The widow welcomed her, her face pale but smiling. "Jane, you're too kind," she said, setting the muffins on her table. "Nonsense," Miss Marple said, sitting. "How are you, Edith?" "Better," Mrs. Price said, her voice soft. "The money's coming back, and the vicar's been by. I was so foolish believing that man." Miss Marple patted her hand. "He fooled many, dear, but you're here, and we're with you." They chatted, the parlour warm, and Miss Marple felt peace settle in. Mrs. Price's spirit was mending, and the village's care would carry her through. She left as the moon rose, her steps light. Back home, she brewed fresh tea and sat by the fire, her needles clicking. The scarf was nearly done, its soft pink a promise of spring. She thought of dollies. Words, "You're a hunter, Jane Marple." Perhaps she was, in her way, stalking lies instead of foxes. But hunting meant protecting, and St. Mary Mead was worth every step. She closed her notebook, its story complete, and looked out at the village. The stars were bright, the night calm. Victor Langley was gone, his shadow lifted, but Miss Marple knew the world held more like him. She'd watch, her eyes sharp, her heart steady. Her needles clicked, a quiet song in the still cottage. St. Mary Mead slept, its heart whole, thanks to its quiet guardian. The game was over, but Miss Marple was ready for the next. Evil thrived. In trust, she thought, but a sharp mind could cut it down. And Jane Marple's mind was the sharpest of all.